Questions?
Lydia.
Thanks. My question is, you talked about how the development of the church in Africa and Asia very much resembles the 2nd century. That's what my master's degree in is, actually Christianity in the 2nd century. But I'm curious then if you find it inevitable that Christianity progress then to what it was in the 3rd century. Will there be intersect fighting and, reduced to bloodshed in the 3rd century? Do you think it will become as intense and as strong and then develop into almost a new form, as Constantine had to basically coalesce all of them together in order to get these various Christian sects to subsist? Because, as you said, they were very obsessed with demonology and spirits and different things in the early Christian world, and how you battle them, the particulars and specifics, were very important, and every sect has a different thing. So do you see it progressing along the same, are we repeating history?
Okay. I don't want to push the historical analogy exactly. I'm sure you know the phrase analogies limp. But what I mean, and what Walls means in the original quote, is that there are a lot of parallels. As to conflicts, we see those now. And I just said, well, you shouldn't use analogies. Let me use an analogy. In the European Reformation, for example, you look at some of the fighting between Protestants and Catholics and the way that developed, and so much of that looks exactly like what's happening in parts of Latin America right now. In parts of Peru, in parts of Brazil, in parts of Mexico, what will happen is, here goes the sequence. The local people carry a figure of the Virgin Mary. The local Protestants turn out to laugh and say, ha, you're putting your faith in this idol. The local Catholics go burn down the Protestant church. And it just kind of... Exactly. And so there are a lot of analogies there. I would also add one thing, since you mentioned the history. When modern historians look at the early church, because they do not believe in the supernatural side of things, they tend to assume that nobody then believed in the supernatural side of things. And you have a great saint, for instance, like Gregory Thaumaturgos. Anyone ever heard of something called the Nicene Creed? Yeah, well, most people have heard of the Nicene Creed. The first draft of that is actually by St. Gregory, and everyone writes about him and what a great thinker and what a great theologian he was. The reason anyone paid attention to him was people didn't say, oh, what wonderful intellectual clarity. They said, what a fine job he does healing people and casting out demons, and therefore, because of that, we'll believe what he writes about the Creed and Christian doctrine. He was also the first person in history who was supposed to have a vision of the Virgin Mary. So I'm not sure how clear the split is between the 2nd and the 3rd century. The good people of Africa, for example, have got one great force pulling them together, which is when you're being persecuted by a Muslim government, the Muslim government doesn't pay much attention which kind of Christian you are. In fact, the Muslim governments are very, very liberal. They will persecute you whatever kind you are, regardless of race, creed. If you're in Indonesia, where at the end of the 1990s, some 500,000 Christians were ethnically cleansed, driven from their homes or killed, government and the militias paid very little attention to what your theological views were. And therefore, that tends to create more of a sense of unity, maybe. Sorry, I'll leave you to say, yeah.
I know one of the first things you talked about.
What's up?
One of the first things you talked about was how, like in Africa, the churches tend to be both charismatic and they also tend to have this like strong authority structure. I know in the United States there's kind of this dichotomy between churches with an authority structure and churches that are like evangelical or charismatic. Mm-hmm. And could you explain why that is a little bit?
Yeah. The short answer is that a lot of labels that we get used to in the global north break down in the global south. And they break down so thoroughly that they should begin to make you question whether we should have them in the north at all. If, for example, you get frustrated observing a Nigerian Anglican service and say, look, what are you people? Are you evangelical? Are you Catholic? Are you charismatic? You know what the answer is? Yes, we are. And they mean it. And so you'll get something like an Anglican church, for example, and just choose that as an example, which looks like an evangelical church in what it does, but it wears liturgical robes, has Catholic aspirations, has basically a Catholic sort of episcopal structure, clerical structure, and is very charismatic. And it makes perfectly good sense to them, probably as it did in the time of Gregory Thaumaturgus 1700 years ago. So what I often do is I look at the divisions as we have them in America, and I begin to ask, well, why do we have them in America? And very often it's a result of historical accident due to the particular way that denominations developed, say, in the 19th or early 20th century. Also, the other short answer is that people aren't consistent. And I always remember one interview. Many of the heads of Africa's independent churches are women. And some of them are founded by women. So women play the key roles as prophets, hymn writers, and so on. And an American journalist was asking the leader of one of these churches, but how can you reconcile this with what it says in the Bible about women shouldn't hold spiritual authority? And she says, well, I have enormous respect for the literal authority of the Bible. I'm also open to God's continuing revelation. So you get the idea. People have a great ability to juggle two opposing sets of views in their mind at any given time. And who's to say who's wrong?
You described that the South is interested in the message of Christianity in terms of the poor and the elements of the culture. But that, in many ways, that's the way liberation theologians talked too. But yet, particularly in Latin America, that's basically disappeared or failed. What's your idea about why liberation theology failed, and yet the other religions are using some of the same attraction and ideas have succeeded?
Liberation theology succeeded very well in some parts of the world. It succeeded in certain conditions. In Latin America, if you look at the history of liberation theology, you tend to get what you might call a mirror image effect that looks like this. Mainly European clergy and theologians bring in these ideas and preach them in Latin America. Then a bunch of Europeans and Americans look at these ideas and say, we are looking at the authentic views of Latin America. No, you're not. Those views then actually have a certain amount of influence. I mean, there are still thousands of base communities in Brazil, for example. Liberation theology still remains alive. But the problem with liberation theology was it paid too much attention to the power, the potential of the secular state. It exaggerated what the state could do. And for many people, the question was, well, why should we go to you as opposed to a socialist party or a communist party? For poor people, they were much more tempted by evangelical and Pentecostal churches, where often they were the ones who got the power to speak out, which was their church, and where they received a message of liberation and deliverance. And for many Americans looking at this, they said, well, what this means is that people are abandoning political idealism for supernatural quietism. They want pie in the sky. And that's not true. It's not fair. The Pentecostal churches in Brazil, for example, they're not so overtly political, but if they're very active on, all right, everybody get together, we have to get the local government to fix that road. And they will campaign for pensions. They will campaign for benefits in that way, but never forgetting that that is part of a spiritual struggle. So in many ways, the Pentecostals took over from the liberation theologians, but maybe they often more rounded message. The other thing I would say is that liberation theology does survive very much, and what I urge you to do is to look at African states, for example, where you have dictatorships like Zimbabwe, and you look at the clergy who are opposing dictators like Mugabe. You have people like Archbishop Pius Nkube, Roman Catholic. And the texts he uses in opposing Mugabe are absolutely pure liberation theology. And how he remains alive, nobody knows. You know, he's dealing with a homicidal government. He's the only person speaking out forcefully. but he just carries so much spiritual weight, the government dare not touch him yet. So liberation theology is there, but maybe as a distinct movement, it got to be too Marxist, too political, too secular, and other groups came along that mixed it into a more holistic message. I don't know how that reflects with your observations. I know clearly you've thought a lot about that.
The only thing I might add to it is that liberation theology did not bring in that deliverance part, the spirit
Exactly.
part. And
Exactly.
I think that was what was missing in it, and that's what I would say.
Yeah. No, I think that's very important. I'm sorry.
Could you talk a little bit about the themes that were in your book concerning the clash between Christianity and Islam?
Sure.
I'm interested in that, understanding it better, and perhaps if there's a resolution other than open warfare and conflict, as you see it.
A couple of people in the room are going to have to bear with me because I talked very briefly about this, but let me address that in more detail. Something you need to know about my book. When you write a book, there are a number of stages that you go through, and the absolute final stage after which you can't change anything is the one that every author fears, because if there's a typo, it's set in stone. That last phase for me, the point at which I sent off the book, The Next Christendom, was a very important day in history. It was September the 10th, 2001. Okay, the last day of the old world. And I'm sometimes asked, how would I update or change what I've said in light of that? And the answer is not at all. I'm sometimes asked if I'm still predicting wars between Christianity and Islam. I'm not predicting, I'm describing. I'm describing conflicts that actually did reach a sizable height in 2000. In some ways, they burnt themselves out. For example, in Indonesia, one reason for that is many of the areas where there were mixed Christian-Muslim communities, now there aren't because the Christians are gone. So there's no war. There's no religious war. Okay? They have peace. One factor which I would probably stress more these days, and have a second edition of Next Christendom coming out next year, one thing I would stress more these days is in order to look at the religious tensions, there are two things you have to pay attention to. One is the role of outside countries in developing and funding new kinds of religious loyalty in areas of tension. African Islam, East Asian, South Asian Islam tended to be very open, very wide-ranging, very Sufi influenced. It's in the last 30 years that money has poured into those areas, especially from Saudi Arabia, with a view to creating new, much more militant, much more intolerant kinds of Islam, more committed to enforcing Sharia law. If you did not take account of those outside forces, Libya has played a great role in West Africa, for example. I don't think the tension would have been anything like as much as it had been. That is a role that I am amazed that Western governments, and particularly the US government, have not confronted, because that's very important. Secondly, I would look at the growth of Christianity as a factor that receives insufficient attention. When people look at Christianity and Islam in, say, West Africa, they assume the situation's always been like that. That's not true. Islam had great kingdoms in West Africa 1,000 years ago. Christianity has an ancient history in Africa, but in black Africa, it was very tenuous till modern times. Here's a figure for you. In 1900, let's take the area that we call Nigeria. In 1900, 33% of the people were Muslim. 1% were Christian. Muslims outnumbered Christians 33-1. By 1970, 2 generations later, the two sides reached parity at 45% each. Christians rose from 1% to 45% in 2 generations. During the 20th century, the most important fact in African history was this. 40% of the people of Africa moved from animism to Christianity, and maybe 5% from animism to Islam. Christianity is much the most rapid growing force, more rapid growing force. Muslims are very conscious about this. Imagine you are a Nigerian Muslim looking at this and thinking, we always knew that Nigeria was going to be Muslim. Suddenly, I have to ask, is my son, is my grandson going to be Christian? And I mentioned earlier in the conversation, the most feared evangelistic tool with Muslims is the Jesus video. This enormously powerful, influential force, allegedly seen by 2 billion people around the world, who knows. And Christians will approach Muslims in a city like Jos in Nigeria, and they'll say, oh, would you like to see a film about your prophet Jesus? Oh, yes, I'd like to see that. And that's when the conversions start, and that's when the violence starts. Between 2000 and 2005, here's a figure for you, between 2000 and 2005, in the one Nigerian province of Plateau, in which Jos stands, 50,000 people were killed or ethnically cleansed. Bet you read about that in all your newspapers on a daily basis. No, you didn't. Depending on the papers you read. So I suggest a couple of things. As I said, Christianity has grown very fast. And just to put that African story in context again, I said I wasn't going to use a lot of killer statistics, but I have to use one. In 1900, there were 10 million Christians in Africa, representing 10% of the population. By 2000, there were 360 million, representing just under half the population. That is quantitatively the largest religious change of any kind that has ever occurred anywhere. Among Roman Catholics, the number of Catholics in Africa grew during the 20th century by 6,700%. For those of you with a humanities background, that's more than double. I don't know who. Yes.
Just a question. I've seen a lot of the same trends.
Can you wait for the
Oh, I'm sorry.
microphone?
I should have thought of that.
I've seen a lot of the same trends that you're talking about within the Hispanic immigrant population in the United States. Kind of this trend toward a more evangelistic, more animated, focusing on healing and visions and a rise of Pentecostalism, things like that in the United States. I was wondering if you see any of the trends in the global South in terms of religion having an impact on the global North as those immigration trends happen.
Absolutely. I mentioned that by the end of the, by 2050 or so, the United States would still have the largest Christian population of any nation. But don't forget what the ethnic basis of that population is going to be. By 2050, America will be here's a phrase you need to know, a majority-minority country. There will be no ethnic majority by around 2050. 1/3 of the population of the United States in 2050 will have Latino or Asian roots, mainly Christian roots. I mean, when many Americans, I think, look at Asian immigrants, they tend to assume that they belong to Asian religions. Well, they do belong to Asian religions, like Christianity. Among Korean Americans, for example, Christians outnumber non-Christians by 12-1. Okay? We're already seeing that, and two examples just to start off. There are a lot of missionary churches based in Africa, based in Asia, which are very active in the United States. Nigerian churches like the Redeemed Christian Church of God, for example, is just building a new headquarters in Texas in an area which 100 years ago the town had the official motto of the blackest land and the whitest people. You know, history has a bad habit of striking back. If you Nigerians are very, very active in the global north generally. The largest church congregation in Europe is in the Ukraine. It's in Kiev, and of course it's Nigerian run. It's run by a man called Sunday Adelaja. The 4 largest mega churches in England are all Nigerian run. 3 Nigerian, 1 Congolese. Okay. If you ask if anyone finds the following joke offensive, I apologize. I just wish to say I've heard it from a Nigerian on more than one occasion. As Nigerians are very fond of telling you when the first American spaceship lands on Venus, there will be Nigerians waiting for them, waiting to sell them something. Lady here.
Is there any affinity ever expected between Judaism and Christianity? Is that totally foreign?
No. Okay, a couple of things. that's actually a very important issue in the world at the moment. American and European Christians generally regard relations with Jews as a very important issue because of the experience of anti-Semitism, because of the experience of the Holocaust. Okay. Now imagine a kind of Christianity that grows up in a society that knows nothing of Jews, that does not share that history. In the global south, there are only two areas that have substantial Jewish populations, South Africa and Argentina. In most of black Africa, Jews are largely an unknown quantity. What that means is, for one thing, new Christian churches have much less compunction about using early Christian attacks on the Jews today. So, for example, when a black African church wishes to denounce the mission churches, like the Methodists, "You're dreadful people. Why would we attend one of your synagogues?" As if a synagogue is a dreadful thing. And if you say this to them, "Are you attacking Jews?" "What's a Jew?" "We're attacking Methodists." And that's a real issue, and I know that's a great source of concern to many black African Christian leaders, like the Archbishop of Cape Town, for example, Undungane, is very, very conscious of the Christian-Jewish relation. And, he says, he does sermons, and he says, how is religion possible after the Holocaust? And he will look at these kind of issues. And so, he would never use a phrase like that. But you begin to look at that relationship between the religions, and in a sense, it has to be negotiated all over again. And you can see pluses and minuses. I mean, you might say, for example, what about the State of Israel? If you are a poor African or Asian Christian, you might think, well, Israel, that's just another fat cat imperialist nation oppressing poor Arabs. Or you could think, well, we're fighting the Muslims here. Israel's fighting the Muslims there. They sound like good people to me. And you could see it going either way. Just a side note. My book, my next Christendom book, actually got long reviews in the two main Israeli newspapers. And what they said is, look, things are serious. Presently, Christians outnumber Jews in the world by 100 to 1. And it's probably going to be like 200 to 1 soon. We have to get back to proselytizing. And it was just interesting. But no, you actually raise a very important point. So there's Christianity in Islam, but there's Christianity in Judaism. Gentleman here. I'm sorry, I didn't. It's kind of hard to.
Maybe you would elaborate a little bit on the resonance of the Gospel of James in the global south.
Epistle of James, sure. Well, I don't have a whole lot more to say about it. What I was saying was, James, if you ever read it, is a very short epistle. And it has almost an embarrassing history in Christianity, because a number of great Christian thinkers didn't like it because it wasn't really spiritual enough. Martin Luther wanted it kicked out of the Bible. It didn't agree with him. Okay, so he wanted that gone from the Bible. It's partly it teaches a very primitive kind of Christianity, which has a number of resonances. And I mentioned some of them. The most important is the one of transience, okay? You know your life is short. This is a gospel for the very poor. But there are also other things. It describes ways of living for ordinary poor people in a mainly non-Christian society. And that might be, in Europe, for example, a whole lesson that Christians are going to have to learn all over again, how to live in a society with a non-Christian majority. And the other thing is it combines messages which people in the West often find conflicting, which make absolute sense for many Christian denominations, North and South. If you look at the 5th chapter of James, it begins with the most harrowing denunciation of the rich. Go now, you rich, weep and howl for the sorrows that are going to come upon you. Your riches have been eaten by moths, The wages of the laborers that you kept back cry out to heaven. It's ferocious stuff. Liberation theologians love this. They quote it all the time. About 6 verses further on, you have the charter for spiritual healing and anointing by the church. People who are Pentecostals or charismatics love this. In Africa or Asia, they take the two parts and say, it's one part. Deliverance, liberation, one message. But that's a quick thing. It also, the book, the epistle, also cites Old Testament figures who are deeply loved in the Global South for the reasons they're deeply loved in the Global South. It cites Elijah, mainly because Elijah controlled and then ended a famine. He made the rain to fall. Gee, that has an appeal. Right? Okay, sorry. Yes. No.
The second part was a spiritual message. What was the spiritual message?
What did I exactly say? Oh, yeah. Sorry, I'm saying in James 5, you have the denunciation of the rich, but then you have the spiritual healing message. So you have liberation, deliverance. Okay, but it's a short epistle. In fact, I'll give you a golden rule. If ever you look at the bits of the Bible that Martin Luther hated, they're the ones that have the biggest impact in Africa and Asia. James, Hebrews, and Revelation. If Luther liked it, it doesn't go down well, and vice versa. So he's like my litmus test. And finally, the gentleman here. Sorry.
I want to know, this may not be something, I might have to get this information from you later, but I want to know more about the hymns.
Yeah.
I have a particular interest in that. I have an interest in music, and I want to know more where I can get copies of translations, of course, of some of these new hymns that you're talking about.
I'm going to say something you're going to hate, which is what you need to do is to buy my new book, New Faces of Christianity, and look in the footnotes. And I'll also tell you something you will like, which is there is no contemporary Western collection easily available of these hymns, and wouldn't that be a great commercial project? So you have to invest to buy the book, but then you become very rich and you can do me a kickback, all right?
What you're talking about today is not the one.
The one I'm talking about at that particular moment. Yeah, just suck it up, okay? You know. But it's in New Faces of Christianity that I talk about. I talk about that, and so much of it, by the way, is a matter of almost chance reference. But there is a lot written in a lot of, say, African religious journals. By the way, knowledge of French as well as English also helps. But one thing I do know is that I am scratching the surface. You know, I am using a lot of these hymns, and I know I'm only using a tiny, tiny share. But time and again, you get these moments where you get, like, you know, crowds under persecution, and everyone will join in this hymn. And there are some hymns that have this power in American Christianity. I suppose Amazing Grace. You know, you could write almost a history of American Protestantism through Amazing Grace. You could write a history of East African Christianity through the Tukutendereza Yezu. Okay? And I hate to give you that answer, but I have to, I'm afraid. All right? Could you give us that title slower? Can I write it? Okay. Thank you. Sorry, thank you. Appreciate it. It's written exactly as it said. Tukutendereza Yezu. Sorry. That's my best effort. By the way, did I ever tell you I used to get thrown out of school regularly for my handwriting? Then word processors came along and life changed. Gentleman here.
How would you, I guess, what's your greatest desire for change among us as Northern Christianity from understanding these principles? How would you expect this to change our behavior and our thoughts as Northern Christians?
Well, a couple of things. Firstly, what I'm trying to do predominantly is to describe. I'm trying to say, this is there. That's stage one. I suppose the first thing I'd like people to do is to talk differently. So when they say, for instance, Christians today believe, who are you talking about? Which Christians? Remembering that most Christians don't live around here. Most Christians, an increasing number, live in the south. The second thing I would probably mention is for people to do an inventory of what they have and what they can contribute. And what I'm not saying is, well, Western churches should put up signs saying, well, the last one out, please turn off the light. Because Western churches have got a huge amount to contribute in terms of knowledge, in terms of education, in terms of money, in terms of medical expertise. Don't forget, African Christianity especially, Asian Christianity also, is about healing in mind and body. And think of which of those facilities, which of those skills, which of these resources can reasonably be applied, but always with the knowledge that this is assistance as opposed to let us help you set your house in order. There's a verse I always like when, how does Christianity arrive in Europe? St. Paul has a dream. So obviously he was some kind of African. And the message he gets in the dream is, come on over and help us. Not coming over and show us exactly how it should be done. Okay? So it's really a question of people deciding what their abilities are and what they're good at, and also being good at recognizing that that culture is important, that cultural forms have to be respected, or a kind of Christianity cannot be transplanted. There's a couple of quick thoughts. Could we do? Yeah, sorry, please.
You made passing reference in your speech to a rather atypical Roman Catholic service in Africa. I'm curious if, in your opinion, there are any of the worldwide denominations that are doing a better job than others in terms of incorporating cultural differences and the spirituality differences in the global south.
By the way, if I may disagree with your question on one thing, that wasn't untypical for Africa, for African Catholicism. I mean, if that happened in the United States, that would be unusual. If you had like mass healing miracles in an American Catholic church, that would be unusual. Africa, it's not. Different denominations do things in different ways, and there are a number of possible ways of going. One is to say, we do this here, you'll do it exactly the same there. Same hymn, same everything. Usually that does not work. There is also complete decentralization. And there's also something which is in between, which is what Catholics have tried to do at different times, which is to say, well, it's very important to respect local cultures, local differences, and we're going to have this very high-powered committee of intellectuals, and we're going to tell you how you can respect local differences. And that has its problems too. Generally speaking, the more decentralized denominations, the ones that don't try to run things from central headquarters, are the ones which tend to be more successful. So I mentioned the Anglicans, for example. The Nigerians the Anglicans in Nigeria have been very successful in that. They just bring in or exclude cultural things, cultural issues, as it seems appropriate to them. The other thing which is kind of interesting in terms of denominations, the other message which is very hard to get is, suppose you have a white European or American denomination which wants to convert the world, and then something really bad happens, they succeed. And then you have people who've grown up in a church for 50 years, and they suddenly see all these people pouring into the church who are Asian and African and Latino, and they suddenly think, well, this is wonderful, but this isn't my church anymore. Why aren't these people respecting my standards? And that's very tough all around. And I mean, just one example, I've given a conversation earlier. Seventh-day Adventist Church is very interesting. Back in 1957, they had 1 million members, mainly in the United States. Today they've got 15 million members, of whom 1 million are in the United States. Oh, by the way, that 1 million in the United States these days are mainly Haitian and Latino and Asian. And they have very different standards. And I've talked to a number of Adventist people who are maybe 60 or 70 years old, and they're delighted, but they're bemused. This isn't our church anymore. And you don't want to say something as crude as live with it, but what you have to say is change is something that happens. You know, the world does change like that, and rejoice at your success. And that's a very difficult message to get. By the way, in terms of denominations, the Assemblies of God, very successful Pentecostal denomination. Here's a figure which I always find a knockout. Assemblies of God founded in 1914 in the United States. For its first 30, 40 years, it was very much an American denomination. Today, on an average Sunday, there are more people worshipping in the Assemblies of God churches in Sao Paulo, Brazil, than in the whole United States. That's impressive. You might have noticed I am not drawing LDS examples or analogies because I don't know the situation well enough to comment. And I have a very unusual academic quality, which is when I don't know about something, I don't say anything about it.
You write about the great development of Christianity in Africa. We see also the horrendous development of AIDS,
Yes.
tens of millions of orphans. Is there an implication or a disconnect, or what do you read into that?
The main thing I would read into it is that the churches in the early stages of the epidemic did an absolutely lousy job of perceiving the seriousness, of responding to it. I would say that historically, don't forget, AIDS has not been around long. AIDS has only been around as a major issue for, 25 years, maybe? As a recognized phenomenon, maybe 20. And they spent a very bad time in that first decade not seeing the situation. I would say that in a number of countries, particularly Uganda, the churches and a strongly Christian president have done a much better job of recognizing, diagnosing the problem, and fighting it. And why this is so important is that within the next 5 years, AIDS, which has been moving north, is going to be hitting this area, one of the most populous areas of Africa. And they have to get their act together by that point. If you don't mind, I will take one more question and then draw this to an end because my throat is complaining a little bit. Sir.
Can you just wait for the microphone, sir?
Yes, sir. You were talking about the Old Testament. Are there certain things that we should look at so when we're talking with the African Christians, so to speak, or the Southern Christians, we can, how can I say this? We can communicate with them because, like you're saying, they understand the sacrifices and so on. And also, while you were talking, you were talking about the Muslim wars and so on. The Hutus and the Tutsis have been killing each other for years now. Are the Christian churches down there trying to make inroads to try to solve that from the standpoint of the peace of Christ?
Well, let me answer the second question first, and I have a very sad story to tell you, seriously. 20 years ago, if somebody wanted to cite an example in Africa of the most successful victory of evangelical Christianity, and Christianity of many denominations, they would have cited Rwanda. When the genocide happened, not only did the churches not attempt to stop it, but very often the people who were doing most of the killing were themselves Christians or Christian clergy. The most dangerous place to be was very often a Christian church, because clergy within that church would use the genocide as an excuse to purge members of the other tribe from their church. Under one church, 12,000 people were buried. The worst example of all, and please understand, I have no, I'm not trying to condemn one particular denomination, but one of the worst performance was the Seventh-day Adventist Church, interestingly. The best people of all, the people who came out of it best, were the Muslims. Because people would flee to the Muslims and they would say, oh, our God is no respecter of persons. That's one comment. In terms of the Old Testament, probably the best thing to do is just read it again and imagine it from African eyes. And there's a large literature on this about the Old Testament through African eyes, because African scholars love writing about the Old Testament. Because so much of it, they say, oh, good Lord, they were doing that then? And in fact, your main danger is not so much saying, here, be interested in the Bible. It's, all right, get out to the Old Testament. Look at the New, honestly. Okay? I'll draw to an end if that's okay. Thank you.